A cafe bully targeted a quiet single father. No one expected his elite combat training. The chair scraped across the tile floor so hard it made a woman near the window flinch and spill her tea. Nobody turned to look at the man who caused it, not right away, because Greg Pollard was the kind of man people had learned not to look at directly, the way you learn not to look directly at something unpleasant on the street. You saw him. You registered him. You looked somewhere else. But one man did not look away. Marcus Cole sat at the corner table, the one tucked against the far wall of Millbrook Café, the one that most customers ignored because the light above it buzzed faintly on cold mornings. He had a paperback in his left hand and a coffee in his right, and his eyes had not moved from the page. Not when the chair scraped. Not when Pollard laughed too loudly at something one of his friends said. Not when Pollard's voice filled the room the way a bad smell fills a room, slow and unavoidable. Marcus turned a page. He was 39 years old and looked older in the way that men look older when they have seen things that cannot be unseen. His face was lean, the kind of lean that comes from years of hard use rather than any interest in appearance. There were lines around his eyes that did not come from laughter. His hands were steady on the book and the coffee cup, and that steadiness was not the stillness of a calm man. It was the stillness of a man who had trained himself to be still the way other men train to lift heavy things. His jacket was dark green and slightly too big for him, which was how he liked it. In the breast pocket, folded into a small, soft square, was a piece of paper that he had carried for 4 months. It was a drawing. His daughter Nina had made it for him at school. She was 5 years old and had used an entire orange crayon on what was meant to be his hair, which he did not have in orange or any other vivid color. She had written his name at the bottom in letters of wildly different sizes. He had laminated it once, decided that felt wrong, and just carried the original. Some mornings it was the first thing he checked for when he got dressed. He came to this cafe every Saturday at 9 in the morning. He ordered a medium coffee, black, no sugar. He sat at the corner table with his back to the wall, which was not a preference but a habit that had outlasted the career that built it. He sat facing the door. He read for 1 hour. He left a tip that was too large for what he ordered, because he remembered being young and working a job like that, and what it meant when someone treated you like a person. Then he drove across town to pick up Nina from her mother's house. He had her for 2 hours. Sometimes they went to the park. Sometimes they sat on the floor of his apartment and drew pictures together, and she gave him detailed instructions on which colors to use, and he followed them exactly. 2 hours every Saturday. That was what the agreement said. The cafe was the buffer zone between the week and the 2 hours. It was the place where he put himself back together before he had to be the version of himself his daughter deserved. Nobody in Millbrook Café knew any of this about Marcus Cole. They knew his order. They knew his corner table. They knew he said please and thank you and that he had learned the name of every person who worked there. Deja, the morning barista, who was 19 and saving for her 2nd year at college. Owen, the weekend manager, who had a bad knee from a football injury he brought up too often. Cora, who worked Saturdays and always had a podcast playing through one earbud. He knew their names. He asked about their weeks and listened to the answers. He was the kind of customer that people in service jobs remember at the end of a hard day when someone asks if anything good happened. He had been coming here for 7 months. He had never caused a problem. That was before Greg Pollard decided he was one. Pollard arrived at Millbrook Café on his own timetable, which meant whenever he felt like it, which on Saturdays was usually around 9:30. He was 38 years old and worked as a construction foreman, and he carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who had never been truly challenged. He was large, not in a way that suggested discipline, but in the way that suggested he had simply always been bigger than most people around him, and had built an entire personality on that fact. He came with 2 friends, always the same 2. Phil, who worked with him and laughed at everything he said, and Darren, who was quieter but compliant, who nodded along the way people nod when they want to belong somewhere even if they are not sure they agree. Pollard liked the cafe because it was close to the site he was managing, and the coffee was strong. He did not much like that the cafe had a quiet atmosphere and small tables, and the kind of customers who read books on Saturday mornings. He found this irritating in a way he could not fully articulate, and so he compensated by being louder than the space required. He had noticed Marcus Cole on the third Saturday. Not because Marcus did anything. That was, in fact, exactly the reason. A man that still, that quiet, in a corner with a book and a coffee, something about it needled Pollard in a way he could not name. Stillness in other people sometimes does that to men who are not familiar with their own restlessness. The first week he walked past Marcus's table and bumped it hard with his hip. The coffee rocked. A small amount went over the rim. Pollard kept walking without looking back. Marcus looked at the table. He took a napkin from the dispenser and wiped the small spill. He turned a page. Deja, at the counter, watched this. She did not say anything because she was 19 and Pollard was large, and she had learned which situations to step into and which ones to observe carefully from a safe distance. The second week, Pollard arrived with Phil and Darren and took the table nearest to Marcus's corner. This was not a coincidence. The cafe had 9 tables and 4 of them were empty. He chose the one closest to the corner. He sat with his chair angled so that his back was partially toward Marcus, which was its own kind of statement. He spoke loudly about a man he worked with who he said was useless, and then he made a comment, loud enough to carry, about men who sat alone in corners on weekends. He said something about how that was a particular kind of sad. Phil laughed. Darren looked at the table. 2 people at the table by the window heard it and glanced toward Marcus. Marcus turned a page. He had heard every word. He understood what was happening the way you understand weather coming before it arrives. He had catalogued Pollard in the first 30 seconds of his first Saturday appearance. The volume, the positioning, the performance of ease that was actually the opposite of ease. He knew the type. He had encountered the type in places far less comfortable than this. He chose to turn the page because a cafe on a Saturday morning was not worth the energy. The third week changed the calculation. Pollard arrived later than usual and the cafe was full, every table taken. Pollard stood near the entrance with Phil and Darren, scanning the room. His eyes landed on Marcus's table. Marcus was sitting with his book and his coffee, and the chair across from him was empty, as it always was. Pollard walked over. He did not ask. He gripped the back of the empty chair, pulled it away from Marcus's table, and dragged it to where Phil and Darren were standing. The legs scraped across the tile loudly. That was the sound that made the woman near the window flinch and spill her tea. The cafe went half quiet. Not completely silent. People continued their conversations, but at a lower register, the way people talk when they are pretending not to listen to something they are absolutely listening to. Marcus looked up from his book. He looked at the empty space where the chair had been. He looked at Pollard, who was now positioning the stolen chair at a table nearby, laughing about something with Phil as though nothing had happened. Marcus set his book down flat on the table. He placed his coffee beside it. He looked at Pollard for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was not raised, not sharp, not anything except completely level, "I would like the chair back, please." The cafe went fully quiet. Pollard turned slowly. He spread his hands in a gesture of theatrical confusion as though the request were strange and amusing. He looked at Phil. Phil grinned. Pollard looked back at Marcus. "You're not using it," he said. Marcus held his gaze. "I would still like it back." Pollard made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a dismissal. He turned back to his friends. The chair stayed where it was. Marcus picked up his book. His jaw moved once. the way a jaw moves when a decision is being made quietly, without announcement. He read for another 20 minutes. He finished his coffee. He left his tip under the mug, folded the drawing in his breast pocket, and walked out. Deja watched him go. She had been watching the whole thing. She felt something uncomfortable sitting in her chest, the particular discomfort of witnessing a wrong thing that had no clean solution. She thought about it on the drive home. She thought about it when she was trying to sleep. She had noticed something that she did not know how to name at the time. When Marcus had spoken, when he had asked for the chair in that quiet, level voice, Pollard had paused, just for a fraction of a second. A flicker of something behind his eyes that was not confidence. It was there and then gone, buried under the performance, but she had seen it. Pollard had felt something in that moment. She did not know what. She would understand it later. Most of the people in the cafe that morning had read Marcus's calm as submission. They had watched a quiet man back down from a loud one and drawn the conclusion that quiet meant weak. They had drawn the wrong conclusion. They would all understand that on the fourth Saturday. The morning of the fourth Saturday started like every other Saturday at Millbrook Café. Deja opened at 8. Owen came in at 8:30 with his bad knee and his coffee and his story about the football game from 30 years ago. Cora arrived at 5 to 9 with her earbud in. The regulars began to filter through. The smell of coffee and warm pastry settled into the room the way it always did, and the light through the front windows was thin and pale because it was October and the season had turned. Marcus Cole walked in at 9 exactly. He ordered his coffee. He said good morning to Deja and asked how her week had been. She told him she had done well on her biology exam, the one she had mentioned the week before, the one she had been nervous about. He said that was genuinely good news. He meant it. She could tell. He carried his coffee to the corner table. He sat with his back to the wall, facing the door. He took out his paperback. He reached into his breast pocket and checked that the drawing was there, which it was, which it always was. He read. At 9:22, Greg Pollard walked in. He did not come with Phil and Darren. He came with 3 people. A 4th man, someone none of the regulars recognized, who was taller than Phil and carried himself with the specific looseness of someone who liked being in a room where something might happen. Pollard scanned the room when he entered. He found the corner table immediately. He said something to the group behind him. Then he walked across the cafe and stopped at Marcus's table. He did not pull up a chair, he stood. "I want to help you out," he said. His voice was pitched at the level of a man who wants an audience while pretending he is having a private conversation. People who sit like they're hiding, in corners, looking at everyone who comes in, it makes other customers uncomfortable. "I'm going to speak to management about it." The couple near the window would later describe what happened next as the quietest 10 seconds they had ever witnessed in a public place. Marcus set his book down. He did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He placed his book flat on the table, the same way he had placed it the week before, and he looked at Pollard with an expression that was not anger and not fear, and not anything the people watching could easily categorize. "You have done this 4 weeks in a row," Marcus said. His voice was so level it was almost gentle. "I have not responded because I have no interest in this, but I need you to understand something clearly." He paused for exactly as long as it took for the room to become completely silent. "What you are doing is not going to continue." Something shifted in the room, not in any visible way, but the couple near the window felt it. Deja behind the counter felt it. Even Cora, who had her earbud in, took it out. Pollard tilted his head. He started to speak. He did not finish. What happened next took less time than it takes to read a sentence. Pollard reached forward. Whether it was meant as a grab or a shove, no one could agree on afterward because it happened so fast and was finished so completely before anyone could process it. What they saw was a hand moving toward Marcus, and then something that was very difficult to describe. Not a fight, not a confrontation in any sense they recognized, more like a correction, a physical fact being stated in the clearest possible language. Marcus did not stand. He moved from the chair in a single motion that was so efficient it barely looked like movement. He intercepted Pollard's arm at the wrist, not grabbing, controlling, and used the momentum of Pollard's own forward motion to redirect it. There was no struggle. There was no exchange of force in any theatrical sense. There was simply Pollard's own energy turned back on itself, and the result was that a large man who had intended to intimidate someone found himself on the floor of the cafe with no clear memory of how he had arrived there. It took 4 seconds. Pollard was not hurt. He would be checked later and confirmed to have no injuries, which was itself remarkable given the speed of what had happened, and which spoke to a level of control that the witnesses would talk about for a long time afterward. Marcus sat back down. He picked up his coffee. The cafe was absolutely, completely, and utterly silent. Phil and Darren and the fourth man stood near the entrance where they had stopped when everything began, and none of them moved. The fourth man, who had come in looking like someone who liked rooms where things might happen, was looking at the floor. Pollard lay still for a moment. Then he pushed himself up to a sitting position. His face was red and his expression was one that had no clear name, not anger exactly, not embarrassment exactly, something between the two that was more uncomfortable than either. He looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at him over the top of his coffee cup. The woman near the window, whose name was Carol and who was 61 years old and had been coming to Millbrook Café for 11 years, would later say to her husband that what she remembered most was not the moment itself, but what came after. The silence. And the way the quiet man simply sat there with his coffee and waited for the room to decide what it was going to do next. Someone called the police. It was later determined to be Pollard's fourth companion, the tall man, who had been so eager to watch something happen and had perhaps not anticipated what form it would take. 2 officers arrived within 8 minutes. One was younger, maybe 26, and moved with the alertness of someone who expected trouble. The other was older, somewhere in his 50s, with gray at his temples and a manner that suggested he had seen most situations at least twice. Marcus was sitting at his table when they came in. He had not moved. His hands were visible on the table. When the officers approached him, he identified himself immediately, gave his full name, stated that he wanted to cooperate completely, and asked if they would like him to stay seated. The older officer looked at Marcus's identification for longer than the look required. He looked up. "Force Recon," he said. Marcus said nothing. The officer nodded slowly, in the way that people nod when something has just confirmed a suspicion they already held. 11 witnesses gave statements that afternoon. The statements were unanimous. Every single person in that cafe confirmed the same sequence of events in the same order. Pollard had approached the table. Pollard had made a threatening statement. Pollard had moved first. Deja's statement was the last one taken. She was still behind the counter, still in her work apron, and her voice was steady until she reached the part about the 3 previous Saturdays, at which point it wobbled slightly, and she stopped and gathered herself before continuing. The older officer asked her if she had been afraid during the incident. She thought about it carefully before she answered. "I was afraid during the first 3 weeks," she said, "not today." The station was a 10-minute drive from the cafe, and Marcus sat in the back of the patrol car with the same stillness he brought to the corner table, the same quality of waiting without impatience that had defined the 4 Saturday mornings leading to this one. He was not under arrest. The officers had been clear about that. He was being asked to come in for a formal statement, which he had agreed to without question, because he understood the process and he had nothing to hide, And because the fastest way through a situation like this was to cooperate fully and answer every question without embellishment. The older officer, whose name was Detective Lyle Horton, drove. The younger one, Officer Pete Calder, sat in the passenger seat and kept his eyes forward in the manner of someone who was still working out what he thought about what he had just witnessed. At the station, Marcus was brought to a small room with a table and 2 chairs and a bottle of water that he did not open. Horton sat across from him. Calder stood near the door. Horton placed a notepad on the table and looked at Marcus for a long moment before he began. "Walk me through your connection to that cafe," he said. Marcus explained it plainly. 7 months, every Saturday, 9 o'clock, the routine, the reason for the routine. He did not give more than was asked. He did not explain himself in the way that guilty people explain themselves, with too many words and too much emotion. He spoke the way a man speaks when he is simply reporting facts. Horton listened. He made notes. Then he asked about Pollard. Marcus described the 4 Saturdays with the same flatness he might use to describe a weather pattern, the hip to the table, the comment about men who sat alone, the chair, then today. Horton looked at his notes. "Did you feel threatened this morning?" "I assessed the situation," Marcus said. His posture changed when he stepped up to the table. His weight shifted forward. What happened was a response to a physical action, not an emotional one. Calder, near the door, made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a question. He stopped himself. Horton set his pen down. He looked at Marcus in a different way than before, with the attention of a man who is revising his understanding of something. 12 years, he said, not a question. He had read the identification. He knew what force reconnaissance meant. He knew what it required, the selection process, the training, the deployments. Marcus said, "Yes." "When did you get out?" 5 years ago." "Why?" Marcus reached into his breast pocket. He took out the folded piece of paper and placed it on the table between them. He did not unfold it, but the shape of it, a child's drawing folded small enough to fit in a pocket and carried there every single day, was its own complete answer. Horton looked at it. He was quiet for a moment. "She's 5, Marcus said. "I have her on Saturdays, 2 hours. I go to the cafe first, then I pick her up." He picked the drawing up and put it back in his pocket. "That's the routine." The room was quiet. Calder cleared his throat. 2 hours, he said. He had not meant to say it out loud. 2 hours, Marcus said. There was nothing more to say about that, and all 3 of them understood it without any further explanation. The formal statement took another 40 minutes. Marcus answered every question with complete honesty and without hesitation. When Horton asked if he had any regrets about how the incident was handled, Marcus thought about it for a genuine moment before answering. "I regret that it reached that point," he said. "I waited 4 weeks hoping it would resolve without contact. It didn't. You could have reported it to the cafe, to us even." "Yes." "Why didn't you?" Marcus considered the question. "Because I did not want to be the reason something escalated. I was managing it, and then it required a different kind of managing." Horton sat back. He looked at the notepad. He looked at Marcus. He looked at the notepad again. "Mr. Cole," he said, "based on the statements we have, and based on what I am looking at, there is no case here against you. The responding action was consistent with reasonable force in response to an initiating physical threat." He paused. "I want you to know that we take incidents like the prior Saturdays seriously. If you had reported it, we would have acted on it." Marcus nodded. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. Pollard was in a separate room down the hall. He had spoken with 2 officers and a police consultant who explained to him, in clear and careful language, the difference between what he had intended to happen and what had actually happened, and why pursuing any formal complaint would likely result in an outcome he would not find satisfying. Pollard listened. He did not say much. The version of himself he had performed for the last 4 Saturdays was a difficult thing to maintain in a room like that one, and he seemed to understand, finally, that the man in the corner table had not been afraid of him at any point during those 4 weeks. That understanding was not comfortable. He sat with it anyway. Darren, who had given his own statement, had been honest about the sequence of events. He had surprised himself by being honest. Later, when he thought about why, he decided it was because the moment he saw Marcus on the floor, he had realized exactly what kind of situation he had been a part of for the last 4 weeks, and it had not sat well with him. He did not go back to Millbrook Café after that day. He and Pollard did not speak again about what happened. Some things, once fully seen, become impossible to unsee. Deja went home that evening and told her mother about the whole morning. Her mother listened quietly all the way to the end. And he just sat back down, her mother said, and picked up his coffee. Yes, Deja said. Her mother was quiet for a moment. That man has seen a lot of things, she said. Deja thought about that. She thought about the 4 Saturdays. She thought about the way Marcus had asked for the chair back with a please at the end, and the way the cafe had gone quiet, and the way she had seen something flicker behind Pollard's eyes in that moment and not known what it was. She knew now what it was. It was recognition. Some part of Pollard had registered something about the man in the corner table that his confidence would not allow his brain to fully process. A quality, a steadiness, the specific kind of quiet that is not the absence of capability but the management of it. He had not listened to that recognition. Most people do not when their pride is involved. It had cost him the floor of a cafe on a Saturday morning. Deja put on her coat and went to the kitchen to help her mother with dinner. The biology exam result was on the refrigerator, held up with a magnet shaped like a pineapple. She thought about Marcus, driving across town right now, probably, to pick up a 5-year-old girl who had drawn him with orange hair. She hoped the 2 hours were good. The following Saturday, Marcus Cole walked into Millbrook Café at 9 in the morning. The room registered his arrival the way rooms register the presence of someone who has been recently seen doing something unexpected. There was a small shift, not dramatic, just a recalibration, the way a crowd recalibrates when it realizes it has misjudged something. He walked to the counter. Deja had saved his table. She had gone back and forth about whether to do it, and then she had done it anyway. She had also put a small glass with a single flower on the table, a yellow one from the bunch she had bought at the grocery store on Friday. She had almost taken it off 3 times before Marcus arrived. He looked at the flower when he sat down. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. She was not sure what to say, and so she said what she actually thought. "I'm glad you came back." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was something adjacent to it, something warmer than his usual careful neutrality. "I always come back," he said. He ordered his coffee. He sat at the corner table with his back to the wall and his eyes on the door. He took out his paperback. He reached into his breast pocket and checked for the drawing which was there, folded small and soft, and always exactly where he left it. Carol, who had been at the table near the window the previous week, was there again. She caught his eye when he looked up from his book, and she gave him a small nod, the kind of nod that is not about anything that happened but is simply about the fact of someone being present and being recognized. Marcus nodded back. Owen came out from the back at some point to restock the pastry case, which did not need restocking, and nodded at Marcus in the way that men nod at each other when they do not have the right words but want the other person to know something has been noted and appreciated. Cora brought his second coffee over without him asking, which she had never done before. She set it down without saying anything and walked back behind the counter. He drank both coffees. He read for an hour. At 11:45, he folded down the page of his paperback, closed it, and tucked it under his arm. He left a tip under the mug that was, as always, more than the situation required. He reached into his breast pocket and checked the drawing one final time. He buttoned his jacket. He stood. He said goodbye to Deja and told her the flower was a good idea. She smiled. He walked toward the door, and then he was through it and outside on the street, and the door swung closed behind him. The cafe filled back in with sound. Carol said something to the man sitting with her quietly, and he replied, and they both returned to their coffees. Cora put her earbud back in. Owen went back to the kitchen. The Millbrook Café continued its Saturday morning, as it had continued every Saturday morning for the 9 years it had been open. Orders were placed. Coffee was made. People sat with their books and their conversations, and their private reasons for needing an hour of somewhere comfortable to simply exist in. Greg Pollard did not come back. Not that Saturday, not the one after, not the one after that. His absence was noticed, and then, in the way of absences, stopped being noticed, because the cafe had a rhythm that accommodated his removal as easily as it accommodated his presence, perhaps more easily, because the room without him was the room it had always been intended to be. What people remembered in the weeks after was not the moment on the floor. That was the dramatic part, and dramatic parts have a way of fading once the room has processed them. What stayed was the smaller thing, the quieter thing. The way a man had sat in a corner every Saturday morning and learned everyone's name. The way he had asked for a chair back with a please at the end. The way he had not left, had not changed his table, had not altered his routine by a single minute in response to 4 weeks of someone trying to make his 2 hours smaller. He had done the calculation that every person who has trained for years in the management of force eventually arrives at. That power is not the same as performance. That control is not the same as surrender. That the decision not to act is sometimes the most demanding thing a trained person can do, and requires more of them than the alternative. He had waited. He had waited because Nina's drawing was in his pocket, and the coffee was warm, and the cafe was a quiet hour before the 2 hours he had been given, and none of that was worth disrupting for a man who needed an audience. When it required something different, he provided something different, precisely, completely, and then he sat back down. That was the part that stayed with people, not what he had done, what he had done after. The coffee, the book, the corner table. The fact that he simply continued. On the 6th Saturday after the incident, Deja's mother came with her to the cafe. She had wanted to see it for herself, the place her daughter had described. She sat at the counter with a tea and looked at the room and at the people in it. And at a certain point, she looked at the corner table where a lean man in a dark green jacket was reading a paperback with a coffee going cold beside him. And she watched him for a while the way you watch something that is interesting without being dramatic. When they left, she asked Deja what his name was. Marcus, Deja told her. Her mother nodded. Does he know how much space he takes up? She said. Not in a bad way, just that he takes up space. The room knows he's in it. Deja thought about it. I don't think he's thinking about that, she said. No, her mother said. That's why it works. They walked to the car. The cafe sat on its corner as it always had, coffee smell and pale light, and the sound of people inside making small Saturday morning sounds, ordinary and warm and continuous. Marcus Cole drove across town. He parked outside a house he no longer lived in, on a street lined with trees that were losing their leaves now that October had fully arrived. He walked up the path and knocked on the door. Nina answered before her mother could get there. She always tried to beat her mother to the door on Saturdays. She had a 70% success rate. She was wearing one red sock and one yellow sock and a shirt that had a picture of a dog on it. And she ran at him the way small children run at people they belong to, with their whole body and no reservation whatsoever. He caught her. He held her. 2 hours. He was going to use every single minute. He reached into his breast pocket with one hand while holding her with the other, and he checked, as he always checked, that the drawing was there. It was there. It was always there. He put her down and took her hand, and they walked toward the car, and she talked without pause about the sock situation, which apparently had a complicated explanation involving a lost sock and a decision she felt strongly about. And he listened to every word of it with his complete and total attention, the way a man listens when he understands what he has been given and how briefly he has been given it. The leaves came off the trees in the wind and landed on the path behind them, and the morning was cold and bright and full of ordinary sound, and none of it was dramatic or remarkable or the kind of thing anyone would write about. It was everything